Welcome to Viewpoint from Overseas. This is Samantar replacing our usual host Faraz Darwesh. Today we have a very special guest with us, Mr. Jared Taylor, who runs an organization called the American Renaissance. Mr. Taylor is a graduate of the Yale University and is an advocate of the rights of the white people in the United States. With me is Riaz Haq, so I'll let Riaz Haq start with his first question to Mr. Taylor.
Hello, Mr. Taylor. I'm Riaz Haq. Welcome to our show. This is Talk for Pak.
Thank you very much.
It's great to have you. I have heard you speak before, and one of the things I noticed as I heard you speak is that you are a real intellectual. You have a significant grasp on a lot of the data that you speak from, and you're very highly educated, very articulate, so we wanted to have a discussion with you. We do have a different point of view than yours. However, it's important that we have a conversation to share what we think, what our views are, and present some data as well. So welcome to our show. Let me begin by asking you a question about the link between race and IQ. I think that's one of the things that you have discussed in some of your earlier shows, and you've also written about that. It seems that you're referring to a lot of the data that has been compiled and published by James Flynn. Is that accurate?
James Flynn is one of the participants in this area of study, but the people that I find most useful are Arthur Jensen, Michael Levin, Richard Herrnstein, Linda Gottfredson, Michael Woodley. There are a number of scholars who have looked very carefully into the question of race and IQ, and I believe the evidence is overwhelming that there are racial differences. And the most intelligent group is in fact Ashkenazi Jews, and then succeeding them would be East Asians, followed by Caucasians, Europeans, and then in the United States we have good data on Hispanics and blacks, descending in that order. So whites are by no means, Gentile whites are by no means the group with the highest average IQ.
So I think the data and this discussion about IQ is relatively recent if you look at human history. Human history is thousands of years old. And, you know, the history has seen different civilizations, different parts of the world, different peoples have their own, greatness. They've achieved, some great feats of accomplishments in the past. The human civilization, they believe began. The human race itself began somewhere in Rift Valley, and then the earliest indications of civilization, human civilization, are found in areas such as Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley. And Egypt, those are thousands of years old. Those are way before the Greek civilization. So what happened? You know, the fact that, you know, after the fall of Rome, the Europeans went into the Dark Ages, a period in which there was complete turmoil, confusion, lack of civilization in Europe. And it's the same period in which there was this Muslim golden age in Baghdad, in the Middle East. So what happened? Do you think what happened to the IQ in that period of people? Do you think that the white either the IQ of the white people suddenly declined, or the IQ of the other people suddenly rose so that they became dominant? How do you see this change over time in history?
Well, those are all excellent questions. I would be very surprised if the average IQs of whites or of Middle Easterners changed dramatically. That's not something that would ordinarily happen. IQ is something that develops over many, many generations of selective pressure. And I don't have a particularly convincing explanation as to why, after Rome, the Western world declined as precipitately as it did, nor do I have a good explanation for why, despite the great achievements of Middle Eastern and Islamic civilization at a certain period, then they declined relatively. There are clearly certain environmental effects that can be brought to bear on a population, no matter what its genetic endowments. And as you point out, there are certain contradictions in the fact that in different periods of history, different groups have been more successful and may be less successful today. On the other hand, there are a certain number of groups which have shown a consistent status. For example, Chinese civilization. Chinese civilization is very old. There is never really a time in which China shows the kind of intellectual poverty that you might find in sub-Saharan Africa or in parts of Europe during the Dark Ages, or in Australia among the Aborigines, or among the Maoris in New Zealand. On the other hand, in the case of sub-Saharan Africans, there is never really a period in which you have seen any kind of real achievement. What you see in these variations that you've pointed out over historical time, there is a kind of jockeying of those who are sort of in the middle. But those who are at the lowest levels of average IQ, or the sub-Saharan Africans or the Australian Aborigines, really have never ever shown much in the way of cultural achievement. And at the same time, the Chinese, who are among the very highest group, or the Jews for that matter, another very, very high IQ group, neither of those two groups has really descended in any dramatic way. So your point is well taken that there have been times when a relatively high IQ race, the Europeans, has not shown a cultural level that is consistent, I believe, with that high IQ. And there are times when the Middle Easterners have done extraordinarily well, certainly by comparison with their standard tested IQ now. And I don't claim to fully be able to explain those variations, but the long historical pattern is, I think, nevertheless consistent with an average difference from one group to another in terms of IQ.
Okay. Yeah, let me remind our audience that we have with us today Mr. Jared Taylor of the American Renaissance, and it's an alt-right group. And I'm coming to the studio, I was thinking why it's important for people like us, who are immigrants, to understand what is happening in this country, and especially with the alt-right movement. The reason is that we live here in California. If I go out of this studio, I will meet people who will be speaking Punjabi or Malayalam or any of the South Asian languages. So with this rise of the right in USA, we must understand what is going on in that camp, and hence we are talking to Mr. Jared Taylor. So maybe we should ask him, what is the purpose of his group, the American Renaissance, and what does the group want to achieve now?
Certainly. American Renaissance is an organization that I founded in 1990, so it's now more than 25 years old. We have been a nonprofit corporation since 1994. The nonprofit group is known as the New Century Foundation, and our objective is to speak in the interests of whites. Every other group in the United States, certainly every other racial group and ethnic groups as well, has organizations, publications, and even sometimes congressional caucuses that look out for their interests. But whites are the only group who are more or less officially forbidden to have organizations that speak out explicitly in their interests. Now, the usual explanation has been that, well, whites are the majority people, and so they don't need groups, that the United States in general is looking out for the interests of whites. But I would argue that that's not the case at all, that whites as a group have interests that are not being preserved, and they're not being preserved because whites always act as individuals, whereas blacks, Hispanics, Asians, and to some degree, South Asians as well. There are Indian groups, there are Pakistani groups, but they are more recent and their activities are less well organized. But particularly blacks and Hispanics and to some extent East Asians, have organizations that push their interests. And some of the interests that are being pushed, certainly in the interests of immigrants, are the idea that diversity is a great strength for America, and that so long as people come from all around the world, it's wonderful for whites, even if whites will eventually be reduced to a minority. And one of the obvious interests that whites have as a group is, in my view, not to be reduced to a minority. I think that if you consider practically any other nation anywhere in the world, so long as it is not a white nation, if you're talking about Pakistan, for example, or Mexico, or Nigeria, or Japan, if you were to go to Pakistan and say, well, what Pakistan really needs is lots of diversity. You need to import, maybe several million Indians while you're at it. And you need to have some Filipinos, maybe some Haitians would be good, Guatemalans, and then you have a much better country. I think anyone proposing such a thing in Pakistan and then suggesting that this is such a good thing for Pakistan that even if Pakistanis become a minority, that would be a virtuous thing. Pakistanis should welcome being reduced to a minority. You would be considered a fool. You would be considered a malicious fool. Whereas in any white country, if a Frenchman, for example, says, well, no, I want France to remain French. And for France to remain French, it must remain biologically French. It must be populated by people who are descended from the people who established France. Such a person is considered a bad person, a moral inferior. And the same is true for whites like myself. By and large, any white person says, no, I do not want my country to be a melting pot and a mishmash. I want my country to be an outpost of European civilization, and I want it to reflect the culture and the heritage of my ancestors. That's considered an immoral thing, but I believe it is not at all immoral. It's natural, normal, and healthy, and unless whites are prepared to say all around the world, this is our country, our ancestors built it for us, and we have no hostility towards you, but you must remain where you are, because if you arrive in sufficiently large numbers, our culture, our way of life will be displaced, and we have a right to our heritage just as you have a right to yours.
So it sounds good. Basically, I hear that you want to be like the Al Sharpton of the white race in this country. Yeah, but I want to, first of all, let's establish the definition. Who is white? Who is a white person? Are Italians white? Are Greeks white? Are Turkish white?
All right. Ordinarily, there's not much difficulty in determining who is white and who is not white. This is a question that arises really only in the context of a debate of the kind we're having now. For affirmative action purposes at a university, for example, Harvard really has no difficulty deciding who is white and who is not, and who therefore will benefit from racial preferences. And in our ordinary lives, if you're walking down the street in New York City, you're not going to have a difficult time distinguishing white people from non-white people. There are obviously some somewhat difficult cases. Southern Italians tend to be swarthier. Armenians, are they white? Are they Europeans? But generally, I think we can all agree that a person is white if his ancestors were living in Europe 500 years ago. People who are descended from that group of people are generally considered to be white, and there's very little ambiguity about most cases.
Yeah, so for example, we see that even Europe has changed over time, so for example, like when the Huns came, and invaded parts of Europe, so would the parts that were invaded by these Mongol people, would they be considered, but you're saying that no, anything before, from 500, you have set up a limit that if people are living there in Europe 500 years, from now, then they are whites. Is that what the definition of whites is?
That's a loose definition. I think you're describing perhaps Magyars, for example, or people who lived under the Huns. The Huns did not stay for a very long period, after all. The Turks, they dominated Greece, they dominated much of Eastern Europe, Central Europe, but I think that by and large, people who are from Europe are white. Some Turkish people have a very large percentage of white racial background, but as a rule, I would not consider Turks to be whites. They're not European. On the other side of the Bosphorus, it's no longer Europe. And again, although many Turks do have a great deal of European ancestry, I would not consider most Turks to be European or white. European to me is almost a synonym for white. I consider myself a European, basically. My ancestors all came from Europe. The institutions of the United States, just like the institutions of all of the overseas European diaspora, are very heavily based in Europe. The language, the culture, the religion of everywhere from South Africa, when it was dominated by whites, to Canada, to New Zealand, Australia, the United States. These are all extensions of Europe. And so I consider all of those people to be a kind of worldwide brotherhood of Europeans. Again, there are certain marginal cases in which it might be difficult to decide who is European or who is not, but I think that, again, in most cases, there's very little ambiguity to that.
So let me, this is Riaz again, Mr. Teller. Let me talk a little bit about diversity, why diversity to me is a good idea and how it has contributed to the United States being as strong as it is, as a leader of the free world, as the greatest power in terms of both economy and as well as intellectual pursuits. Let me compare a couple of places here. I live in California. In fact, I live in Silicon Valley, which is predominantly, which is no longer white majority. I think less than 40% of the population here is white. California as a whole has about 40% white population. California today is the center of innovation, center of the most leading edge technologies in the world, whether it be related to the computer, the software, the internet, life sciences. And there's a lot of the people who have contributed to this development over the last, this population change, by the way, has happened over the last 20 years. The demographics has changed from majority white to majority non-white in this period. Now, compare that to France. Today, the California GDP is larger than that of France. Just last year, California passed France to be the 6th largest economy. California has a population of just 38 million people, 40% white. France, on the other hand, has a population of about 68 million people, 85% white. So what I conclude from this data is that that California has been the beneficiary of having the diversity that it does, which has contributed to its dynamism, to its growth, to its realizing the potential that it has. Why is bad for the country as a whole? Just looking at the example of California, it's been so good for California. Why can't we say the same thing about the United States? How does it hurt the white people to have a country where there will still be a plurality, but that country is still the leader of the world? It is the greatest power on earth. It continues to be vibrant economically, technologically, politically, and in terms of military. Why is that a problem?
Well, the shortest answer is that if whites become a minority, and if the government then falls into the hands of people unlike us, it will no longer be our country. The question of California is an interesting one, and there is no doubt that a certain number of immigrants have contributed very substantially to the development of Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley was started, of course, by white people. And the diversity of California as a whole should be distinguished, I think, in a very important way from the diversity of Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley has attracted some of the most intelligent and innovative people from all around the world because it is a center of innovation. On the other hand, Mexico as a state has attracted a very, very large number of Latin Americans, predominantly Mexicans, many of whom are not particularly endowed intellectually or culturally or in terms of any other way. California would be much better off if it did not have this enormous population of Central Americans whose educational levels and whose productivity is low. If you're talking about a specific case of Silicon Valley, and again, this is an area that has attracted some of the most brilliant minds from all around the world, and I would guess that if you're going to count up the number of immigrants who have contributed in really meaningful and remarkable ways to Silicon Valley's development, it would probably be maybe several hundred, maybe 1,000, I don't know. It would be difficult to put a figure on that. On the other hand, the masses of now Latin Americans who live in South Central Los Angeles or just in California in general, they do not have an intellectual and academic and productivity levels that are promising for the future. If you want to understand the future of the United States, there's really one particular statistic that I think you should bear in mind, and that is that in the case of blacks and Hispanics in the United States, many of them drop out of high school, but those who make it to the 12th grade are doing mathematics and reading at the average level of white and Asian 8th graders. They are 4 years behind. You find this difference in every school district entirely across the United States. There are about 15 or 16,000 school districts in the United States. And in all of them, blacks and Hispanics are performing at a level that is considerably lower than that of whites and Asians. This is not, again, because all of these school districts are somehow discriminating against blacks or Hispanics and in favor of Asians, who are usually doing better than whites. It's because this reflects a real difference in ability. And if you look at Silicon Valley, those who are contributing remarkably are certainly not blacks. They are certainly not Latin Americans or Hispanics. The immigrants who are contributing in an important way to Silicon Valley tend to be Eastern Europeans who are themselves white, and also Asians, some subcontinental Asians, East Asians, because those are the areas that produce high IQ people. Now,
you know, there are a lot of South Asians here too, and South Asians, according to the IQ calculations, the numbers I've seen, have lower IQs, about 8. You know, Indians, for example, have an IQ of just 81. Pakistanis have an IQ of 84. And they are a very large number of Indians and Pakistanis here who are technologists, who are in key positions in the industry.
Yes, of course, they are not typical of Indians and Pakistanis. It's like immigrants from Africa into the United States. I believe that Africans have a larger per capita number of PhD holders than Native Americans. But this is not because you're getting utterly typical and average Africans coming to the United States. You're getting really the cream of the crop. And the same is...
But that's good for the United States, isn't it?
Well, it's better than getting the kinds of Mexicans we get. Well, the Mexicans that come to the United States are not at all the cream of the crop. Mexicans and Central Americans, they tend to have high crime rates, high poverty rates. In fact, if you look at the use of welfare in the United States, Central Americans and Mexicans consume welfare, means-tested programs, at rates even higher than that of blacks. They are not at all contributing economically. But this, to me, is basically a side issue. If you replaced the white population with high IQ East Asians, for example, if you went and found the smartest Chinese and Japanese and Koreans, and you replaced whites, you could very well have a country that had a higher per capita GNP, had a lower crime rate, had a lower illegitimacy rate, but it would not reflect my ancestors. It would not be the United States that Europeans built. To me, the question of whether or not there's an economic contribution, that is a secondary one to the question of the survival of my people as a distinct population group with a distinct culture of their own. That, to me, is the fundamental question, not whether there is a slight per capita GNP improvement if there are more East Asians. You can make the reverse argument when you're talking about Mexicans, Central Americans, Haitians, certain other South Asian groups. Hmong are a very low productivity group. But no one in the United States officially at any rate even thinks in these terms. We're all supposed to assume that anyone who comes to the United States, so long as he's not white, and preferably if he doesn't speak English, that contributes to diversity. A wonderful thing. This to me is absolute folly. And I agree with you. There are certain cases in which immigrants, non-white immigrants, have made technological contributions, economic contributions, and that's all fine and well. But again, I do not want my people to be replaced by anyone, even if the people who are replacing my people are superior to my people in every way. I believe that whites who built this country, established its institutions, have the right to a nation in which they are the unquestioned majority and in which they leave their stamp for eternity on the civilization and on the institutions that they are part of.
Yeah, I'm really enjoying this conversation because most of the time people who come, immigrants like myself, who come here to either of the two coasts, we meet people, the so-called white or European descent people who are like bleeding heart liberals. These are the people who are sorry about a lot of things, that the European descent people did, including slavery and all that. So I'm enjoying this conversation because I am learning a few things. So Mr. Taylor, American Renaissance, it sounds like you want to go to some golden age in time of the U.S. What is that golden age that you want to take this country back to?
I'm not looking to go backwards, only in the sense that I wish to live in a country in which it's taken for granted that whites are to be the majority and that whites are to establish the culture. This was what all Americans really assumed their country was about until a very, very significant law, the Immigration Act of 1965. Until that time, the United States immigration policy was based on the idea of keeping the United States majority white. And until in the 1960s, the white population was almost 90% of the American population. And in 1965, when the Hart-Celler Act was passed, it was promoted with the idea that there would be no big change in the demographic mix of the country. It was promoted with the idea that there would never be as many as 1 million immigrants coming in every year, and that this was sort of a kind of window dressing. It was during the Cold War, and the idea was that we would compete better with the Soviet Union if we did not have an immigration policy that was discriminating against third world people. Well, if at that time you had explained to the legislators who were debating and considering passing this bill, if you'd explained to them that in only 70 years' time, the 90% majority of whites would be reduced to a minority, I can promise you that bill would never have been passed. No one ever asked white people if they wanted to become a minority. And I can assure you, at that time, they would have said, absolutely not. Now, if you ask white people today, would you prefer to live in a majority white nation? Most of them would be too afraid to say yes. But if you ask them, well, can you name a majority non-white neighborhood that you would like to live in? Or can you name a majority non-white school that you'd like to send your children to? Most of them can't think of a single one. And yet they do not have the mental stamina, the backbone, the racial sense to stop measures that are turning vast parts of the United States into precisely those neighborhoods, those schools in which they would not feel comfortable. So whites have been intimidated and browbeaten to the point where they would never say, oh yes, I want my country to be majority white, or I want my neighborhood to be majority white. But look at how they live. Look at who they invite to their dinner parties. Look at what a wedding reception looks like for a white couple. very occasionally you get some kind of real mixture, real celebration of diversity. But most white people, and they are like people of other races as well, are more comfortable being around people like themselves. So there's an enormous amount both of hypocrisy and fear on the part of whites. There are very few whites who are prepared to say the sorts of things that I say, and yet if you look at how they live, it's clear that in their bones they agree with me. They want white neighborhoods, they want white people to marry their children, and yet they would never dare say so. But until they are prepared to say so, then they will lose their country, they will lose their culture, and they will become a minority, and perhaps even a despised minority, in the nation that their ancestors founded and established.
Okay, so I get this, but do you think that if such is the case, that you are afraid that the European descent people will become a minority and that would be a bad thing? You think that there should also be an American Indian renaissance, that they won't like to go back this country to before the Europeans came here?
They might like that, and I certainly agree that the history of the United States is a catastrophe for the American Indians, and it's too bad for them. But at the very least, the Indians resisted conquest. What whites are doing is without precedent in the history of the world. Whites have the ability and the power to maintain their majority status. And yet, unlike any other people in the history of the world, they are not resisting. They are welcoming their own dispossession. This is what is absolutely astonishing about whites. It's as if they're saying, sure, take this part of our country, take that part of our country. Go ahead, reduce us to a minority, and go ahead, treat us as if we are the villains of history. Go ahead and tell us over and over that we exploited the blacks, we persecuted the Indians, we were bad to the Hispanics, we were bad to the Asians. No group in history has ever behaved this way. And if whites do not snap out of this self-loathing, they will simply be shoved aside.
No, my question was this claim to a country. So why is there not a stronger claim by the American Indians? They could say that, Mr. Jared Taylor, this is not your country that you are trying to preserve. It was and it is our country. So all the immigrants, including Mr. Jared Taylor, should go out.
They could make that claim, and there are some Indians who do make that claim. But if you are going to operate on that basis, how far back do you go? Do you give Japan back to the Ainu? Do you take all of North Africa and say that the Arabs living there, who invaded in, I believe, what was it, about the 8th and 9th centuries, are they all supposed to go shove them all back into the Arabian Peninsula? At some point, you have to deal with the situation as it is. I'm not saying, again, that the history of the United States was a wonderful thing for the American Indians. I think it was a catastrophe. On the other hand, North American Indians were a Stone Age group in a very sparsely populated part of the world. And if they hadn't been conquered by whites, some other group, maybe Asians, would have come. At that time in history, the rules were different. If you were able to conquer a territory, it belonged to you. And it was essentially white people who changed those rules. There are very few parts of the world that are occupied by the original autochthonous people. There are such places. But, yes, I certainly agree that if I were an Indian, I would resent what whites did to my country. And yet, Indians, as I say, they fought it as desperately as they could, and they were conquered by a technologically superior people. And, again, how far back are you going to go if you're going to give territory back to the original inhabitants? If you start doing that, there's no end to that. Who does Israel belong to? Does that belong to the Hivites and the Jebusites? Does it belong to the Jews? Does it belong to the people who came after the Jews? I mean, again, there's no solving this problem. Egypt as well. Egypt is now populated by Arabs. The Arabs there displaced the original population, which looks more like Copts than anything else. But the point is, at some point you have to decide, well, the people who are living there now are the rightful owners, and they should have the right to dispose of their territory as they see fit.
So my question is, human migration is as old as humanity itself. It's generally believed that we all started in the Great Rift Valley, essentially the part that is now Africa, between Africa and the Middle East. And we have spread as human beings all across the world. The word Caucasian itself signifies having its origin in the Caucasus Mountains area. So the point is that, for example, I'm from South Asia. I'm actually a Pakistani. The part that is now North India and Pakistan is actually the people there came from the Caucasus Mountains, Central Asia. That's what the genetics studies tell us. Similarly, people who are in Europe, a lot of them, most of them actually came from that same area, the Caucasus Mountains, Central Asia as well. So what you're suggesting, it seems to me, is that should end now, that people should just live wherever they are, not move, that every continent and every part of the world belongs to a certain race and no other race should have any claim on it? Is that what you're saying?
By and large, yes. And I believe you would agree if there were people from all around the world wanting to move to Pakistan and saying, well, if we manage to sneak across the border into Pakistan, legally or illegally, we have just as much right to be here as Pakistanis who've been living here for hundreds of years.
Let's forget the legality issue aside. Let's move that aside right now. I'm talking about legal movement now. First of all, history, there's no such thing as legal or illegal migration. People just moved wherever they could in those days. This legality issue is more recent. Now, what you're suggesting is that even legal migration is unacceptable to you.
Well, legal migration is up to the nation that establishes its legality. And practically all non-white nations are very careful to control any kind of legal immigration. And they would never countenance movements of people that would dilute their culture or their race or their heritage. And I'm sure Pakistan is absolutely no exception to that rule. If millions of Indians, for example, Pakistan and India have a very uncomfortable history together. But if millions of Indians, well, Kashmir is a good example. Here this is claimed by both sides, and both sides resist intensely the idea of giving up any portion of Kashmir to the other side. And if millions of Indians wanted to move legally or illegally into Pakistan, Pakistanis would absolutely resist that because they think they have a right to that territory and they want that territory to reflect their heritage, their destiny. And I agree 100% with that. It is only the white countries in which the local inhabitants are not allowed to say, no, this is ours, and sorry, you can't come. And if you wished to make an argument that North America belongs to the Indians, if that's the case, why is it that people from Asia, people from Africa, why is it all those other people can come too? That argument is made only to the detriment of any white group. It would never be made to the detriment of a non-white group that actually conquered territory they now live in.
The argument was that just as Europeans came here and established a system, the argument was that similarly Europeans should be open to other people coming to this land. The argument was not that it should go back. It was just for the sake of argument to you, since you are insisting that it should remain a majority European country. There was a counter-argument that Hawaii should not remain a majority American Indian country. But no, we're not saying that. We are saying that countries should be able to benefit from immigration, but at the same time, I understand your point of view that you feel threatened from this, the advantageous position that the European descent people enjoyed in this country. They are losing that position, and that is why they are feeling threatened. That's fine. So then, my question to Mr. Taylor is that we talk about races as if these are frozen things. I just want to understand, how were races formed? When were they formed? Were we always classified, divided into different races? What's the origin of races?
Well, race is like subspecies in animals. You could describe dogs. Dogs are all the same species, but there are different breeds of dogs that are subspecies, and that is the equivalent to races. Horses can be the same species, but they're different breeds of horse, antelope, etc. And race is simply the word that we use to describe subspecies in human beings. And
is it biological or is it cultural?
Oh, it's clearly and obviously biological. It is the idea that race is a sociological concept, that it's some sort of optical illusion. To me, that is so wrong and so stupid that only very intelligent people could persuade themselves that it's true. I mean, after all, the difference between, a Central African pygmy and a Dane is obviously not a sociological difference. It is a biological difference. And pygmies will continue to breed pygmies generation after generation, just as Danes will. And to pretend
so where does one drop of blood rule come from in the United States? Even if you have one drop of black blood, you're basically African.
Well,
isn't that cultural? Because that person could look just like white people, behave like white people, do everything like white people, and yet be considered black.
Yes, I would say that that is a cultural distinction. But the original African and Caucasian distinction, that is biological. It is, if you go to Brazil, for example, there are many, many different terms for various kinds of mixtures of white, black, American Indian. People are very vividly conscious of these things. But the original races that are mixed together are clearly biological. I think to pretend otherwise is really quite ridiculous.
Yeah, so I understand that part about different breeds of the same animal, but you are carrying your argument even further. You are saying that these different races of humans, they have different IQ, and I think there was some interview where you also talked about the brain mass of.
Yes.
Yeah. So what I am not understanding is that what were these Europeans eating that increased their brain mass, and what we missed out on?
I think, as a matter of fact, I'm not sure about any brain size studies of Pakistanis or Indians, but the brain size studies that have been conducted in the United States are very clear that East Asians have larger brains than Caucasians, and Caucasians have larger brains than Africans. This is something that resulted from many, many thousands of years of separate evolution under separate environmental pressures. The theory generally is that if a group evolved in the north under very difficult climactic circumstances, especially in which if you had to plan for the future, if you faced long, long winters and had to store things, if you had to fight, if you had to bring down big game that required cooperation between many different individuals. This kind of thing put an enormous pressure on people to breed more intelligent individuals. More intelligence was much more highly correlated with survival than it would be in environments such as the tropics, in which it did not require that kind of planning ahead. It did not require that kind of cooperation to bring down game. It did not require building shelters that would last through very, very harsh winters. I think that it's not difficult to imagine that under those circumstances in which the environment is particularly harsh, those would be areas in which there would be a more significant evolutionary pressure to evolve towards greater intelligence. That's what we find in North Asia, East Asia, and also in Europe.
Yeah, so you think that the Eskimos are more intelligent than other Europeans?
No. The Eskimos, they did not evolve. They evolved to some degree in colder areas, but they did not spend as much time in that area. And also, there were two general phases of cold weather evolution for Europeans and for East Asians. Eskimos, as I understand it, they only went through one of those phases of cold weather evolution. But no, there are exceptions to the rules. But no, they are not on average more intelligent than East Asians or Caucasians.
Okay, because that was the argument that if you live further north, then you have all these problems. My question is now, I mean, the way the demographics of this country are changing, and it is pretty much a certainty the way the so-called whites are producing versus other races are producing children, that the European descent people are going to become a minority. What do you propose that would change it?
Well, I would certainly stop non-white immigration into the United States.
Even if you stop that, the people who are already here, they are producing. Yeah.
It's true. Whites are not reproducing. They're not reproducing their own numbers. They are at what's called sub-replacement fertility. And I don't know what the solution to that is. I suspect, though, that whites would probably have more children if they were living in the United States that respected their European heritage, that did not constantly treat whites as the villains of history, that did not constantly demand of whites that they renounce their white privilege. I think all of these things are a terrible psychological burden on whites, and that if white Americans lived in a society that recognized them, affirmed them, talked about their destiny as Europeans, talked about their ancestors as heroes rather than villains, I think that too might encourage them to have more children.
Well, there are many examples. You know, this decline in fertility is not an American phenomenon. It's happening everywhere. In fact, Japan is probably among the worst, and that is a country that is almost 100% homogeneous.
Yes, I agree.
In Japan, the total fertility rate right now is 1.4 children per woman. They are selling more adult diapers now than they're selling children's diapers. So why is that happening? Now, there are also other examples. There are many European countries where there are very few non-whites. They're essentially all European, all white. And yet, they have the same issue.
Yes. Well, I think Hong Kong and Singapore have total fertility that are actually less than 1. At least in the case of Hong Kong, I believe it's 0.98, perhaps the lowest reproductive total fertility rate in the entire world. There is something that has to do with modernity and technological advance that seems to depress birth rates, that seems to make people more self-centered and to wish to enjoy their own lives rather than bringing more lives into existence. But I do not, nevertheless, retreat from my view that I suspect there would be more whites having more children if they were not part of a dwindling group and not part of the group that is always considered to be to blame if anything goes wrong for
No, but that should also be true of these other countries.
No, they're in different circumstances.
The point is that they have very few minorities in those countries, and yet their birth rates are declining even more rapidly than the Americans.
I agree. But those are slightly different circumstances, and I think people's birth rates react to different things. I can't prove to you that whites are having lower birth rates in the United States because of this constant persecution of whites as evil oppressors and racist. I can't prove that. It's my speculation, though, that probably depresses white longevity, it probably depresses white birth rates, it probably results in a certain amount of depression, it certainly results in feelings of guilt. All of these things are completely unnecessary and are a burden that whites bear in the United States that they do not bear in Hungary or Poland or Slovakia or the Czech Republic. That's certainly true.
And they're in a worse situation than the United States.
Yes, their birth rates are declining too. And the same is true, as I said, in Hong Kong. The same is true in Singapore, Japan, Korea, Taiwan. All of those countries have sub-replacement fertility. But the Asians, at least, are not making this an excuse to bring in people unlike themselves.
And that's a problem for them. Look at what's happening in Japan. Is a serious problem right now.
We'll see.
There will be no Japan in the next couple of 300 years if it continues the way it is right now.
Those who are...
I mean, that is like writing your own death warrants is what they're doing.
I disagree completely. The Japanese, they will prefer to be smaller in numbers then to be displaced and replaced by people unlike themselves. And so 100 years from now, if instead of, maybe 120 million Japanese, if instead of 120 million, let's say there are only 80 million Japanese.
And they're all retired. What happens to them? You know what the worker to retiree ratio is in the United States right now?
Oh, it's what, about 3 to 1?
No. It's lower. It's close to that. It's about 2.8.
Yeah.
There are 2.8 workers for each retiree. And you know the fact that retirees are mostly white, whereas the workers are not mostly white.
All workers are still majority white, but
Yeah.
all of these arguments, they are economic arguments, and to me, the economics.
Yeah, but that's what's necessary for survival. I mean, it's not just economic. The point is that you're retired, you're old, and you can't really take care of yourself. Somebody has to take care of you. Who's it gonna be?
The Japanese, believe me, the Japanese will survive. They have invented robots to help put old people into and out of their bathtubs. They are not going to let themselves be replaced.
The point is this. The robots cannot do the innovating, they cannot do the thinking, they cannot be creative. In order to innovate, in order to create, in order to do new kinds of things, you need a young, dynamic population, which they will not have. Robots can only do repetitive tasks, they cannot do the thinking tasks.
And so you think the Japanese should be letting in millions of Filipinos, Iraqis?
They need to open up if they want to survive.
I beg your pardon. Well, they will survive in smaller numbers and perhaps in greater poverty, but they will be Japanese. And that is a choice that is entirely up to them, and that is a choice that I support. That is their choice. You cannot inflict on them a different destiny, even if you think that would be good for them. That is not your right. Just as if white...
No, I'm not claiming it's my right to do it. I'm just pointing out a fact that's what they're doing right now.
And I think that they will, in the long run, there will be a distinct Japanese culture that remains. Whereas if the Europeans fail to start...
90-plus-year-olds have culture? I mean, these guys can't even take care of themselves.
Oh, come on. They are still having children. It's not as though there are no children.
Very few. 1.4 is the ratio that I've heard.
Well, let us hope that they're able to increase their birth rate and not abolish their people.
History tells us that nobody has been able to do that. It's very difficult to reverse this decline.
Well, we will see, and they will try, but let's hope that they will succeed, and let's hope that white populations will try and succeed also. But no, that to me is not an acceptable choice to engineer some kind of replacement of my own people by a different people. If that were okay, then we might as well replace ourselves with intelligent robots.
No, that's not the point. You will still have your race, except that it will not be 100% your race. It may be 80% your race. It may be 50% your race. But you'll still have the future. If you don't do that, you don't have a future.
We have a future, believe me. I'm glad that you're concerned about it, but all of these are...
I'm absolutely concerned because I live here in this country. I'm concerned about the future of this country. My children live here.
Let's see, all of these arguments...
Believe me, I'm just as concerned, if not more concerned, than you are about the future of this country.
But see, all of your arguments...
Because see, you didn't choose to be in this country. I chose to be in this country. That's the difference between you and I.
All of your arguments support the idea that the United States will be better off if people like yourself come here, because people like me are somehow inadequate. We are not doing enough, and you will come help us. No,
I'm pointing out the facts. I'm not saying that I am the one who's going to save you. What I'm pointing out to you is the reality, what's writing on the wall, that we all need to see.
And you are saying that it is immigrants like yourself who will save all these old geezer white people like me. Doesn't that make you feel wonderful? And how does that make
It doesn't make me feel wonderful because I'm going to be an old geezer too one of these days. And I'll need somebody to look after me.
And yes, and so you're saying yet more Pakistanis, yet more Mexicans.
No, I don't care who it is. I'm not asking for Pakistanis to come here. I'm saying as a general issue for this country, if you have very few people working and a lot of retirees, you have a serious problem.
Well, I'm sorry. We will solve that problem one way or another by raising the retirement ages, by perhaps there are establishing the least expensive group homes, by having robots to look after old people. Let us figure that out for ourselves. We would rather figure that out for ourselves than be replaced by people unlike ourselves. And again, don't neglect the fact that all of your arguments are supporting your presence in my country as a newcomer who represents a different culture, a different way of life, perhaps a different religion, and you are the process that is changing the United States from the one that my European ancestors established with the idea that it was to be forever a European nation.
And I believe we're changing it for the better. I believe we're changing it for the better. For your survival and for our own survival.
Yeah, he does not agree with that, yeah.
Well, yes. No, I must say that it does amuse me when people come from outside the United States and explain to me, whose people have been here ever since the 17th century, that you have come for my own good. Even if I don't want you here, you're here for my own good. Do you realize how arrogant that sounds?
Yeah, maybe
well, I think you're pretty arrogant too by claiming that you alone can take care of these issues.
No, which is he's taking care of his own race. Yeah.
We'll see what happens to the Germans.
Yeah.
We'll see what happens to the Hungarians. The Hungarians refuse to accept any immigrants.
Yeah, and they're going to have a much worse future than those that do accept the immigrants.
They will certainly not have any Islamic terrorism. They will certainly not have any race riots. They will certainly not have problems of diversity.
Islamic terrorism is just a canard. There's so few Islamic terrorists compared to the number of Nazis who have killed people in the world. In the history is filled with Nazi killings of innocent people.
No Nazis.
Millions and millions of people have been killed. Even today, the new Nazis are killing people.
Oh, who are they?
In the United States, a lot of these white supremacist groups are going around killing people. They're the ones with the guns.
No. Now you're really losing control here. Name a single neo-Nazi who has killed people. Well, let's see. Maybe that.
Yeah, Quebec, in Canada.
Far more Islamic terrorists who've been killing people around the world, anywhere than anyone.
There are 30,000 people who die in the United States every year from guns.
So what?
And a lot of these people, gun-toting people, are white supremacists in the United States.
Name a few.
He just said, in Quebec there was this guy who shot people. What about Dylan Roof in South Carolina? What was he? Wasn't he a white supremacist? He said he was white supremacist.
He was certainly not a neo-Nazi. You're talking about Nazis here. In any case, this is all a very unhelpful quibble. I'm sure that if you compared Islamic terror on a per capita basis to any kind of white terrorism on a per capita basis, Islamic terror is far more lethal in the United States than any kind of what you could describe as white supremacist terror. But the point is, think about
30,000 versus 20. That's the figures that I hear. Since every year.
Wait. You think white supremacists kill 30,000 people in America every year?
Yeah, those are mostly people who are the gun toters.
Many of them are. Yeah.
No. This is a silly argument. You've been doing pretty well so far, but this is really silly. About half of the murders in the United States are committed by blacks anyway. And in fact, the murder rate in the United States, I think it's about 15,000 a year. It's not 30,000. In any case, just because a person is white and is a gun owner doesn't make him a Nazi.
Yeah, I understand. But, I really enjoyed this conversation, Mr. Jared Taylor, and especially because we do not hear this point of view very often. So really appreciate that you gave us time for this show. And this is it for the time being. And see you next time in Viewpoint from Overseas.